What can philosophy do about the problem in Ukraine? How can a subject so abstract and inaccessible to most of us help bring peace in the world? Well, I've long thought that philosophy has a very important part to play in resolving conflict because it not only acts as a very fair and independent arbiter, it helps us transcend our own ways of thinking and put us inside of the mind of our opponents, their persuasions, their arguments, their sensitivities. And in doing so, you invite them to do the same to yourself, and you open this middle ground where something can be shared. So I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to do something a bit uncomfortable for many of us. I'm actually going to pretend that I am a NATO leader, a Johnson, a Biden, a Scholz, and I'm going to speak to Putin directly, replaying his arguments back to him, to invite him to occupy the middle ground, to see if there are common things that can be shared, if there's been misunderstandings. And in doing this, I use this as an experiment to show what philosophy can do. This is called the principle of charity. I do this obviously with the greatest possible respect and conferred honor and admiration for those people fighting and dying in Ukraine. Dear Mr. Putin, you have just invaded a sovereign country because you have felt aggrieved. What is your argument? It goes like follows. After 1989, you thought that the reason for existing of NATO had ceased to exist, and that even if it did continue for other reasons, it needed to extend the hand of friendship towards Russia. What's happened instead is that NATO did not extend the hand of friendship, even though they increased ties of trade and communication, but they expanded eastwards. Now, this expansion took on very peculiar military characteristics. And now, on your borders in the former in new states in the Baltic region are the army bases and air bases and missile bases, nuclear missile bases of your former adversaries. And so you must be asking yourself, what does NATO want all these bases for? And why do they want them so near Russia? Could it be in the near future that my entire western boundary will comprise of NATO states? And what are they going to do with all this apparatus, especially if they're nuclear? And it feels like you've been asked to consent to a situation where, very politely, of course, and very gradually, no doubt, but very surely the impression has been made to you that your will is no longer the final law of Eastern Europe. And so your behavior in the last couple of years has been trying to show NATO that it hasn't made its intentions clear and that you actually feel afraid that there might be an act of aggression in the future. So, like a dormant cancer, NATO is not gone, it's not a dead enemy, but is simply asleep, it's simply dormant, and that at any moment can rise up and conquer all. Have I got this right, Mr. Putin? Because if this is the case, then I can say, as a pretend Western leader, that your arguments are not only plausible, they are actually justified. Former foes do not expand in this way with such military characteristics without something behind it. And you might feel that NATO, yes, they were anti-Russian, might have been anti-Soviet, might have been anti-communist, but at the heart of their paradigm was actually anti-Russian. So, if this is the argument, I think that this is very plausible, but now I must bring forward my own view and argument. I believe, Mr. Putin, that even if this is the case, you have completely missed the point. After the new states of the former Soviet Union were established, especially in the Baltic regions, NATO countries recognized them as free and independent states. At the heart of NATO are liberal democracies, and liberal democracies advance freedoms of people, the rights of individuals, their rights to elect their own government and to establish their place in the world. And why do we do this? Because at the root of our way of thinking, we believe that when free peoples are integrated and there's mutual exchange of interest, then actually greatest happiness is achieved. And so when we look at people who are free and newly free, we think that it is a good thing. We think that it is an opportunity to advance freedom for everyone and happiness and prosperity for everyone. Their choice to be in NATO was not affected, we think, by anything other than their freedom to align themselves with this idea. On the other hand, there was Russia that had fallen and had relinquished power. Can I bring your attention, Mr. Putin, to the fact that this decline is not something that is peculiar to Russia itself? If you think of the former European empires and what they did with the new states which they bore, look at the Commonwealth, right? From India to Australia to Kenya, there is not one country in the Commonwealth that looks to Britain and is ever anxious about a resurgent British Empire. Instead, Britain did her best to not only give these countries independence, but to give them the best chance as independent states in the New World. We set up the infrastructure of government, of local and national government, of finance, of trade, hard infrastructure as well, the redistribution of wealth, which included a fair transfer of wealthy estates that were owned by white settlers to local owners. We were there in their independence party celebrating their independence. And now there's a relationship between Britain and many Commonwealth countries that is mutually beneficial. And they are free to express this. If you look at Kenya, for example, where I'm from, Kenya recently has decided to turn to Russia for development aid. Kenya thought that there were too many strings attached with development towards the Western democracies. Now, Western democracies think that this is a mistake because this will significantly compromise their autonomy in the future. However, we have in no way compromised or threatened their right to make the decision for themselves, and they know this. These countries know that we fully believe in their independence. And more than that, a country like Britain has a track record of defending the free and vulnerable around the world. If you look at the First Great War, we went to war for the sake of, to use the phrase that was used then, plucky little Belgium. In World War II, we established a war with a very supremely powerful Hitler for the sake of Poland. Basically, when we speak of freedom, these aren't just words or signed treaties. The world knows that we really mean it. Why am I saying all this, Mr. Putin? I'm saying this because the new states in Eastern Europe don't feel the same way about Russia. They still feel threatened by Russia. And that is not something that is your fault. And it's not even something that they can trace back to the Soviet Union. The relationship many of these states have had with Russia goes back for generations. And unfortunately, it is a history of oppression and tyranny that is seared in the minds and the national consciousness of these peoples. In order to feel free and safe near a new Russia, these countries would need more than just the assurances and insurances of signed treaties. They would need to have seen that Russia had changed from its soul, that they believed in their independence and their freedom to behave, even in a way that was contrary to what Russia wanted, just like Kenya and the development aid with China. Now, even though this history is not your fault, it is certainly something that you could have changed. And in the first decade, there weren't very promising signs. There was, the corruption of President Yeltsin, and then you came over in the 2000s, and you were a bit of an unknown entity. But the need for assurance for these states to see that you had changed, there was, it was still there, and they needed something bigger. What you did instead was the contrary. You have shown yourself to be very similar to the very types of leaders that these peoples have feared for generations. Your political opponents are either dead or in prison. You have amassed wealth, you and your henchmen have amassed wealth on a scale and proportional that far exceeds some of the criticized governments in places like Africa. You punish your own people for arguing against you, for demonstrating their opinion that does not fall in line with yours. And that's just the Russian people, the very people whose prosperity and welfare and happiness you're meant to be advancing. How are your neighbors meant to think? What is the world meant to think about how you think of them? And your misdeed continued. Your infiltration of your military aircraft in other people's airspaces, the shooting down of military aircraft, or thinking of that Turkish plane, civilian aircraft, the Malaysian Airlines, the poisoning of your opponent in other people's territory, in other people's countries, the eventual invasion of Georgia and Crimea and Sevastopol. All this has shown to the Eastern European states that you are not the sort of person they want to be in a relationship with, because they feel that in your mind, their independence is an accident of history. They really should be a part of Russian control or Russian influence, and it is something that they feel. And so what do free people do? They choose freedom, and that is why they ally themselves with NATO under their volition. I promise you, Mr. Putin, if Poland, if Lithuania, if Latvia had not chosen to be in NATO, they would not be in NATO. They came to us because of what they offered. What you should have offered them was what, for example, Britain offered the Commonwealth. A complete assurance that you believed in their independence and their freedom and increased trade and mutual prosperity. Now, Mr. Putin, you have just invaded Ukraine. And despite all the arguments about your anxieties of NATO expansion, you have just shown yourself to be one of the worst of the tyrants in Russian history. Your behavior in this war, your bombing of innocent people have shown something a lot more than just that you are aggressive. We are not actually convinced that you understand what freedom is. We're not fully convinced that you appreciate the sanctity of human life. And so you have given every possible reason for the whole world, including your neighbors, to do anything but ally themselves with you. And in this case, we must also include the Russian people, who are heavily censored. So, Mr. Putin, we must say, this invasion of Ukraine has shown the worst bit about you and your beliefs, and that is what we are reacting to. However, I would like to think that if you had a change in mind, a heart, which would be nothing short of a religious or spiritual conversion, and showed to many of the states and to the world and to your own people that you fully believed in freedom and the rights of individuals, I would like to think that you would be forgiven by the people of Ukraine, by your neighbors, by your own people, and by the world. I would like to think that that would happen. The world wants and needs to be integrated with Russia. They want to see Russian happiness. They want to see a Russia free. The question is whether you're the person to take it there. So if there are grievances on the Western side, we are Western liberal democracies. We can look at ourselves and say that we have got things wrong. And if the expansion of NATO was something that was done badly, we can look at our behavior and say we got it wrong and we will take responsibility for it. And we've done that with behavior in our former colonies, with slavery, so many other things. We can do this about NATO. We don't mind admitting we are wrong. But you would also have to do some big admitting as well, including an apology. You would have to show the world that you have fundamentally changed. And I would like to believe that if this was the case, and that you are ready to treat these independent states as nothing but free and independent states, then much would be forgiven. Thank you.